This week in Pure Reinvention.
Part of the transformation was you're no longer a department of city government. You are now a business, and you have to get yourself to sustainability. And that was enshrined in our enabling legislation. That was the goal that we were given.
Episode 40, Part 2 with Patrick Bero, Detroit Regional Convention Facility Authority CEO and CFO.
Engage, disrupt, adapt, repeat. You're listening to Pure Reinvention, the podcast for curious people.
Welcome to this edition of Pure Reinvention, where our goal is to bring interesting information to those curious individuals who are interested in the reinvention process. I'm here with our sparkle artist, Misty Miller. Hi, Misty.
Hello, Mike.
So, part 2 of Patrick's interview, which was probably for me the most interesting, only because we haven't had a lot of people so far who've really, Misty, talked about the financial support and initiative that goes behind a lot of the reinvention process.
What I liked about Patrick was he's a good storyteller and he understands the Cobo story, but he can also apply the work and the numbers and all of that, the business side of it too. So that's why we're kind of doing the 2-part episode here, is because he had so much to share in 2 very different veins of the same story.
Exactly. And the backstory, of course, is Patrick is trained as a chief financial officer. He's also been trained as an entrepreneur, having run his own business. So when he was approached by the decision makers to be in the role that he is in now, he really had to think about how he could bring his talents together to this project. And quite honestly, the things that Patrick is going to talk about are the things that sometimes as leaders we're afraid of. Those really the nuts and bolts, or the X's and O's of how you start to finance or you start to capitalize some of your new initiatives. Many times leaders feel or understand that they can only finance their new initiatives off of the current cash flow. Mm-hmm. And if that were the only option that Cobo had available to them, they would have not succeeded. And so to listen to how they were able to capitalize their new initiative was just fascinating. And I think for all leaders in the reinvention process, learning how to capitalize your next phase is right now some of the most underutilized information we have available.
Well, I think what we learned in this is business as usual can be reinvented, even when it feels like you have to follow a very strict structure.
So the pillars of finance, the pillars of sales and marketing, the pillars that we maybe haven't normally given so much prominence to as leaders, to me, start to now take center stage. And I think as people listen to Patrick and they listen to the lessons of finance, they'll see how important that ability plays in the reinvention.
Let's listen to this conversation and we'll see you back on the other side.
So let's talk for a minute about this new model, Pat, because I think this new model is going to be very interesting for a lot of our listeners who may be struggling with their current model and realize that there's more that they can deliver to their members or to their customers. The first area that I want to kind of review with you is the role that disruption played in the Cobo Center, realizing that they needed to do something different.
So you got the Society of Automotive Engineers and the North American International Auto Show, 2, quote, naturals and long-time customers. And again, long-time customers tend to get taken for granted. And when one of them finally stood up and said, you know what, we're not going to be taken for granted anymore. This is too important for us. It's too important for our industry. Unless you make changes, we're leaving. And at the time, Cobo, our first year, Cobo Center made $3.6 million in revenue. The auto show was almost half of that. So major customer. Now, let's set aside for the fact it was only $3.6 million, which was completely unsustainable. But more than half your business is one show. And you could see why that would create some consternation among the powers that be.
But the reality was Cobo had a significant disruption, which made it continuing on that course to be non-sustainable. How did the decision-making surrounding a unsustainable model begin to change and shift in your observation to allow for it to think in a different way?
Well, for us, it really was a total reinvention of the way we did our business. And when you have again, the definition of insanity, doing the same thing over and over again, expecting a different result. If you're losing money and continually losing money, you've only got a couple choices. One, you either have to cut out the expenses to eliminate the loss, and you can only cut your way so far. And the alternative is then after you go through that exercise, making yourself more efficient, which I am wholeheartedly for. Business has to stop wasting its resources, and you have to start committing them to enterprises and effort that gets you return. And in a municipal environment, during the Detroit bankruptcy, one of their advisors, Miller Buckfire, had gone out and they were soliciting bids for parking assets. Well, one of the valuable pieces of our business that have helped us transform is the use and utilization of our parking. So we were interested. And they came to us and they said, well, given that you're a government entity, you're not going to expect a significant return on your investment, so you're going to be willing to pay a little more. And I said, that's not true. There was an assumption that we weren't going to expect a return on our investment. Well, why would you do that with the taxpayers' money? I'm a taxpayer myself. Why would I want my money wasted and pay more for something than it's worth? And I told him, no. Most businesses expect 20%. That's what I expect, and they were shocked by that. Part of the transformation was you're no longer a department of city government. You are now a business, and you have to get yourself to sustainability, and that was enshrined in our enabling legislation. That was the goal that we were given. One is now that you've got the clear goal, you have to get yourself where you're sustainable long term. How do you go about doing it? Well, one, we got to figure out where are we paying too much for stuff, go out to the market, get open bids that are open and transparent. Everybody can see it. Everybody can see how the selection process works. And for us, that was critically important because, again, part of the problems that the city had is there was this perception of corruption. There was perception that the game was rigged and it was fixed. So you wouldn't get businesses coming into bid because they assumed, one, we're not going to win it anyway, so why am I going to waste the time? Or two, in order to win it, I'm going to have to pay somebody off in order to get in, and that's going to be something either I don't want to do or it's going to cost me too much, I'm not going to get involved. So we had to first establish a level of trust and transparency to show everybody that this is a new day, we are doing things differently, and by demonstrating that trust repeatedly over and over again in the way the decisions were made, we were able to expand the bidder pool, which increased the competition, ended up lowering costs, and you also no longer got, it used to be required, well, you're going to pay me half up front, or you're going to pay me all of it up front, or you're going to pay, the bids are going to be 20% higher to do yours because I know there's a substantial risk that I'm not going to get paid. We eliminated all of that through the openness and transparency, and then we committed to paying people on time. And again, basic blocking and tackling, but for the way things had been done before, that was an earth-shattering move for the vendors and customers at Cobo Center. And by establishing those basic business fundamentals, we were able to reestablish trust.
What was the story around how you were able to get enough leadership to not only support the initial core thought, but then, of course, that leadership has got to sell that story long-term to make it a sustainable activity?
Well, everything that we do streams from our board members. And they set the vision, they set the tone for how we operate on a daily basis. And again, it's back to expectations. And they didn't give us a 500-page rule book of this is everything you're going to do. They gave us some fundamental business principles. One of the things I say repeatedly, and I get a lot of sayings from my dad. He wasn't a man of many words, but he would give a lot of life lessons, little phrases that I take with me to this day. And everything you as a person need to do to get through life successfully, you learned in kindergarten. Share with others, be nice, follow the golden rule, be honest. And if you do those things are going to largely fall in place. And the board has done very much the same thing. Run this the right way. Be honest with your customers, be transparent, treat them fairly. And if you do those things, you're largely going to be successful. And that's the board's given us those directions. We've got very tight financial controls in place. Why is that? Well, because there was the perception of all this corruption. So we locked it down, and we demonstrated to the taxpayers of the state that this is the way this is going to be run. It's going to be secure. Your investment in this facility is going to be secure, and we're going to do this the right way, and we're going to make it something that you can be proud of. And at the end of the day, if you ask me, like, what am I most proud of? It's really a couple things. One, we've been able to deliver on what the board promised. The board, my first day was the day that the board unveiled its master plan for what the new Cobo was going to look like, and we've delivered on that. If you take that initial animated video and you walk through the center now and follow that animation, we've delivered exactly what we promised. And we did it within budget, and we did it openly and transparently, and we've accomplished all the goals that the board has set for us with this capital program and this reinvention of the center. But the other piece, and this is something that's going to reveal itself 5, 10, 15 years from now, it's my sincere hope that 10, 15, 20 years from now, the people of this state look back on what we've done here now, and I hope that they will count this as the best investment they've ever made. That the economic impact that's resulted from this investment will be the best thing that they've ever done. And we knew from the beginning when they set us up, because this was trailblazing, if you will, this new regional authority, it was thinking outside the box, that all eyes were going to be on us. And there were a lot of people that wanted us to fail. And by doing things the way we were doing, we assured that we weren't going to fail. And you had all the board members come together with one objective, and it was to complete this task and to do it the right way. And each of them brought their areas of expertise to the table. Each of them helped guide us, and they were confident enough in who they were that they knew what they didn't know, and they were willing to go outside and seek expert advice when they needed it. You know, there were many calls when all this started, $800 million to $1 billion to be spent on we're going to tear Cobo down and we're going to rebuild it. Well, the board said, well, wait a minute, what's the market say that we need? And they went out and they surveyed the market. And they didn't only survey our customers, which is what a lot of businesses will do. The guy that comes in the door every day, that's the guy you're going to survey. Well, you definitely want his opinion, but that guy or gal who's walking in your business every day, you've already sold them. What about the person who used to come to you and left? What do they think? Well, that's what they did. They went out to the customers and they said, what do you need us to do? They said, you don't need an $800 million facility or more exhibit space. What you need is a legitimate ballroom. What you need is flexible functional meeting space with monitored amenities and AV. What you need is modern controls for access to the facility. And we'd like you to maybe take advantage of this beautiful riverfront that you got, which right now all we see is a brick wall.
You had a vision for how to rebuild this facility into a state-of-the-art, attractive facility that would attract customers. But the one thing you didn't have was money. How did you connect the story with the capital needs that would be required to this degree in a creative way that would allow for the responsible use of capital, that would allow you to have the capital necessary to build what your vision was, when most people don't know how to attach the story to the capital needs that they have?
Well, you got to have a good story, or else the market's not going to respond. I mean, that's really where it begins. If your business fundamentals in your story and your vision aren't something that's appealing, the market's not going to respond to you. So in my other life, I was a consultant, and I would get called into organizations when things weren't going well. And I can't tell you how many times I've encountered businesses that they did their feasibility studies and they fudged the numbers a little bit and they bumped them up a little bit to make it look good for the banks. And then you come in, now they can't meet their interest payment, or they can't meet their the overall bond payment, and they're wondering why. And then you go back and you look at, well, yeah, because you took this number here and you goosed it up 15%, and now you're surprised when you're not able to meet your payment. Well, first of all, you got to start by back to the kindergarten rules. Be honest. If your business is one thing, don't sell it as something else, and take on financing that you can legitimately support. And in our case, it was a unique story because our fundamental credit hasn't changed. The same credit that we're using now is the same credit that the city was using. It's the Convention Facility Development Fund. It's a fund that's been in place for a long time. And there are three revenue streams that flow into that fund. It's the statewide liquor tax, it's the the 3-county hotel tax, and then there's a distribution from the cigarette tax that comes in. And the unique structure of our funding is that theoretically Cobo Center could close down, and any bonds that are supported by those streams still get paid because those revenue streams aren't linked to revenue at Cobo. They're linked to other things outside. Now, the hotel tax for the 3 counties is kind of linked to Cobo, but the liquor tax isn't, and the cigarette tax isn't. And so that was the kind of security for the deal. So from a financial support scenario, we had a very strong credit that should have been appealing to the market. But because of the way Cobo was run and the bad press around it, there's such a thing as in the financial community called headline risk. Banks and lenders, they do not want to be associated with organizations that are giving them headline risk. So we had to change the story to get people interested in us. So when the authority first went out to the marketplace, early on, they said, okay, we're going to get the funding, the $279 million that the enabling legislation allowed us to borrow. We're going to go out to the marketplace and borrow it. Nobody would lend them money, in spite of the fact that it was a secure credit. It was an A-rated credit when the city had it, and nobody would lend them money. And so Wells Fargo stepped up to the plate, and they gave us a bridge loan of $80 million, which allowed us to get started. We were able to reimburse ourselves through the initial $3.25 million emergency repairs, and we started on phase 2, which was the bones of the building, repairing electrical infrastructure, repairing doors, repairing the loading dock, replacing old dilapidated escalators and elevators that used a ton of energy and were constantly breaking down. Just those fundamental bones things of the building, getting those fixed. But nobody else would lend us money. Well, then as we started to transform and we demonstrated to the marketplace that this was a new day and we were truly running this like a business, more and more businesses started getting interested. And when we went out for the first round of full financing to fund the entire project, the $279 million, more businesses started getting interested, and we issued an RFP, and we got tremendous response. But even at the time, there was some concern about how we do that. Do we go permanent financing through the bond market and lock in?
Which would be more traditional, correct?
Which was far more traditional. And the objective there was the rates at the time were historically low.
Right. So why wouldn't you lock
exactly
in the
right.
traditional market?
Lock them in and be done. But the objective that we were pursuing was not only, first of all, get the money, but again, part of who we are. We want to be good stewards of the taxpayers' money. So we went to the marketplace and we said, we want to do this to create the greatest possible value for the taxpayers. How do we do that? Is it going the traditional route and locking in these historically low rates, or is there a different way that we can do this that would save the taxpayers more money? And
so by asking that simple question,
yes,
you opened yourself up for multiple answers.
And that's what we got. And what we got was we got a consortium of banks stepped up to the plate and said, we will provide you this funding, and we will do it in a way that it acts as a construction loan. And the difference for us was, if we had gone to the traditional bond market and borrowed $300 million, you start paying interest on the full $300 million the day that you issue those bonds. By going the bank consortium route with JP Morgan, Wells Fargo, and PNC, we were able to get the funding in the form of a construction loan where we start paying interest when we draw it down, and the rates through the consortium were lower than what the bond market was offering. So when we went the less conventional rate, and it wasn't the first time this thing had been done, but it was unique enough that the government took interest in it, and they wanted information on what we were doing so that they could determine whether or not they needed to dedicate more resources to regulating and overseeing this portion of the business. And again, a testament to how we do business, we were able to demonstrate them very quickly that this was a legitimate way of doing it, and it was not only a legitimate way, it was a great value way to do it. And we answered their questions, and the audit went away. But then when we went out and got the permanent financing now, we were more than 3 times oversubscribed in the marketplace. There was such demand for our bonds now that we were able to differentiate ourselves. And keep in mind, this was the time when the city was in bankruptcy.
Right.
So we were able to successfully differentiate ourselves to the point where the market wanted our bonds more than 3 times the level that we had to offer. And by doing it the unconventional way, we were able to save the state's taxpayers about $30 million by going the private placement route first and then going out for the permanent funding, simply because we asked the question, how can we do this for the best value for the taxpayer?
So we talked about the disruption. We talked about the political courage to not be afraid to create a new entity and all the things that surround it both politically and operationally. You've walked us through the financing side, how to ask the question to see what the different opportunities there are to finance. The final question. Things tend to like to go back to where they started. How does the role of leadership sustain all of these new initiatives that you have talked about so that we don't end up back in the old Cobo situation and indeed we're building on what you have started, Patrick?
I grew up in a home where I was taught that competition is good. Competition makes everybody better on both sides. And I believe firmly that if you embrace competition, that tends to keep you sharp. Organizations that try to shield themselves from competition are the ones that in the long run end up having more difficulty than they otherwise should. We recognize more than anything that we are in a highly competitive marketplace. Municipalities all over the United States, all over the world, are investing a great deal of money in centers to attract visitors to come and hold their events here. And the reason they do that is because there is substantial economic impact from it. I talk about $279 million to renovate Cobo Center. The auto show alone is $350 to $400 million in economic impact annually. Now, that doesn't all come to Cobo Center, but that comes to this region, and that's the business that we are in. The business that we are in is attracting that economic impact, not to just us, but to the broader community, and to create those jobs and to spur that activity. And if we embrace the fact that we are in competition and that we are always look at who is against us, who is trying to lure that business to them, and constantly be in constant pursuit of ways to do things better, meet and exceed the customer's expectation of performance, I believe that you will sustain it. But it really does start at the top. It starts at, what are you willing to tolerate? Are you willing to accept second best? Are you willing to accept just okay? If you're willing to accept mediocre, then mediocrity is what you get. If you demand excellence and you exhibit it every single day and do the little things. I would never ask anybody in a Cobo Center to do something I am not perfectly prepared to do myself. And on more than one occasion, I'm walking down the hall, I pick stuff up, I throw it in the garbage. If I see something, I make it right. Doing those little things and people seeing me do those little things, that behavior tends to emulate itself. I believe that if you understand what your role is, and then you make sure, again, that people have the resources they need to do their job, you clearly explain to them what they need to do their job, that's what is going to be produced at the end of the day.
Phenomenal interview. Thank you, Patrick.
It was a phenomenal interview.
It was, in my estimation, outstanding. Now, I know, Misty, and you're going to make fun of me for this, that I do like the kind of the nuts and bolts behind all of the story that makes it a success. But I think a lot of leaders don't get this kind of backstory that is so important to being able to put the whole picture together.
Something that I love to hear, and you're right, this is the backstory you need to know that stuff exists, but they thought that Cobo was going to need all of this billions of dollars of rehab, and instead they went to the market to find out what really was necessary.
I think that when you're doing your strategic planning to look at the reinvestment that's got to happen, you have to go through that aggressive assessment phase. You have to go to the market. You have to ask people. You have to ask the people today, what are you buying? I think what's happening in a lot of companies and in a lot of associations is they're assuming they know because of what their members or their customers used to buy, and that is a tragic assumption that is causing a lot of failure in today's marketplace.
Well, and oftentimes you get so close to a project. Everybody knows that when you're so close to it, you're not looking at it with the clarity that you really need to create that change.
And many times what also happens is the operations side of the business may understand what the market says, because they're also looking at the cash flow for their business. But the board is sometimes out of step. And so one of the things that I heard Patrick say was, the board, had this expectation. And then we, as the operational side, had to perform to the level that the board expected. So what they had, Misty, was they had an entirely new board expectation. And because of that, the operational side of the business was forced to change the story. Now, granted, everything was primed, so that was absolutely acceptable in what they wanted to do. But I think that's key in understanding if you're going to get different results. There's this expectation, and we have to change the story.
I liked the term he said about headline risk and how Cobo was a scary thing. And we also heard a story from him about the fact that Detroit, just having the word Detroit in their business name was a scary thing. So there are all of these risks that people are assuming based on their story, but they were able to rewrite that and retell it.
And those were the partners that the Cobo Authority had to work with. They had to work with these banks who would come to them and say, "Can you take Detroit out of your name so it may make it easier for us to do our paperwork and we can then borrow money?" And you know what Cobo said?
No.
They said no. They said that's who we are. And because of that posture, and because they were willing to own the assets that they had, and I think this is absolutely brilliant. And instead of looking at the conventional bond market that existed and doing it a certain way, they had somebody like Patrick that was smart enough to look at the different models of financing that were available and put together a unique and competitive package that allowed Cobo to succeed financially while they were building out the kind of space that would be so attractive.
That was a super cool point to me. And what I took away from that is, instead of being risk adverse, instead of going with the traditional expected way to finance this, they said, oh, maybe there's an alternative here. Let's keep digging a little bit more. And just when you think you have the answer, just dig a little more.
I think you don't have to listen to Patrick very long before you realize that he's the kind of a personality that never gives up. When he's given a challenge, he's going to do his professional best to understand and figure out what all the options are. And Misty, guess what? That is a responsibility as leaders we have to our constituency or to our members or to our customers. I think too many times we are disassociated from who we are accountable to when we are looking at the performance of a company, which also includes the financial performance. And when we go back and we understand what the accountability is, which is look at what the market is and look at what the board expectation is, understand what your growth expectations are. Understand when you are an asset like Cobo, where you've gone too long, you begin to see the marvelous window that opens up, but almost everything you see there is a brand new way of doing business.
And that came back from talking to the market. It was tapping into the people that stopped going to Cobo, tapping into the people they wanted to come to Cobo, and then simplifying what they heard and really sticking to it.
So here's the real takeaway, Misty, that at the end I really heard from Patrick, and I want to kind of finish up this segment with. You're always fearful that when you start to dramatically change something, that it has a habit of wanting to go back to where it was. And so it wants to go back to not having the competitive advantage. It wants to go back to kind of some of the old habits. And certainly for a facility like Cobo, who's been there for a long time, it has the tendency to want to go back. And for many associations that we work with who have a long, rich history, they have a tendency to want to go back to where they are. Patrick said, we are encouraging competition. So instead of many businesses who are fearful of competition, Patrick realizes when you encourage competition, you have then the ability to stay up. And when you encourage competition rather than discourage it, you do a much more aggressive job of making sure you are sharp on every single one of your pillars of reinvention. And you're sharp on your financing, and you're sharp on making sure you stay in touch with your customers, and you're sharp on making sure you're taking advantage of your key assets, and you're sharp about making sure you're planning your future, and you're sharp about making sure the board of directors is working very strategically for the future, and you're sharp with your management, and you're sharp with your employee training, so that you leave no stone unturned.
It reminds me of something we like to say here. Get comfortable with being uncomfortable. Stay just uncomfortable enough that you are looking for that change and finding new ways to create growth.
This was a great conversation. Remember, if you're ready for a change, make it a change that lasts. Make it pure reinvention.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Pure Reinvention. Keep the conversation going and get alerts when new podcasts are up by following us on Twitter at Pure Reinvention or sign up for our mailing list at purereinvention.com.